All right, so how did the ideas of the Renaissance spread? Well, first of all, we got to think about a couple of different ways of how ideas spread anyway. First of all, we've already talked about trade and how the ideas of trade moved, or rather trade moved ideas. So there's one way. But a second way that ideas spread was Italy at the time of the Renaissance was the center of a whole intellectual blossoming or resurgence in Europe. And so what a lot of people did is they would send their kids, wealthy people obviously, the nobility obviously, would send their children down to Italy to be educated at their universities. And so they, when they came back from college, when they came back from studying down there, would bring the ideas back. But probably more so than anything else that had an impact on spreading the ideas of Europe and the ideas of the Renaissance, particularly to the north, and how the northern Renaissance spread and came from the southern Renaissance, was the printing press. The printing press was invented in Europe in the 1450s by a guy named Johann Gutenberg. So the printing press, invented in 1450s by Johann Gutenberg, helped to spread the ideas of the Renaissance, because what it did was it easily moved type. You could print things quickly, and more importantly, you could print things cheaply. Books. Remember, we've talked about this. Monks had to set in and copy books basically for years, and it took a long time, and it was very expensive to have a copy of any book, the Bible, the newspaper, whatever. So ideas became cheaper, easier to access, because what happened was people could buy things more cheaply. Another impact of the printing press was things called broadsides, which are basically just big posters, were easily printed now. And these big posters or broadsides could spread the word about what was going on in the town. It was sort of like your town newspaper. And they would take things and they would stamp them on the church door. The main church was like where everybody went for the news, so they nailed them to the church door. Dong, 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 dong. And that's where they got their news. And these broadsides would help ideas spread more quickly. So as ideas spread more quickly, more people began to read. And as more people began to read, they began to want more books. And so since books were cheaper, there was a higher demand. And so people began buying and reading more books. So what ideas were they got published in these books? Well, some of the ideas were put forth by a guy named Darius Erasmus. He's somebody who's really important. You really need to know who Erasmus was. When you can see the years of his life. And Erasmus was a writer in the Northern Renaissance. He lived in what is modern-day Belgium or the Netherlands. And so what Erasmus was famous for, he was what we'll call a Christian humanist. He was a Christian through and through, believed in God, believed everything that Christians believe. But he also believed that humans didn't have to rely only on God. He didn't believe in superstitions. He was very logical about the way that he approached life. And he believed as a humanist in our natural ability to understand and communicate directly with God. And he didn't believe in, again, many of the superstitions of the Catholic Church. And so he wrote a book called In Praise of Folly. And you need to know that. That's very important. You need to know. And he wrote this book basically making fun of all the superstitions in the church. And one of the things that he disagreed with was the ceremony of the church and the ornateness of the church. He didn't believe that it had to be so elaborate. Yes, it might honor God in the multiple steps that you take to say a prayer to him or to communicate with God. But some of the things that the church did were simply ceremony for the sake of being ceremony. So they were too elaborate. And he thought that the beliefs and the actions himself were wrong. Well, Erasmus had a student whose name was Thomas More. Thomas More was an Englishman, lived from 1478 to 1535, as you can see right there. And Thomas More didn't exactly criticize the church, but what Thomas More did was Thomas More criticized European society. And when Thomas More criticized European society, he wrote a book called Utopia. in which he described the perfect society. He said this is where everybody ought to live. Now, it was fiction, and he actually didn't say this is where everybody ought to live. He pretended that he took a trip to this perfect world where everyone was equal. And one day the king would be, well, the king. And then the next day the king would be the trash keeper. And because everyone had an equal role in society and would eventually have every other job in society, they treated each other much better. And he was really criticizing the levels and the separation in English society, or in all European society as well. And lastly but not leastly is somebody we're not going to spend a ton of time on, but it's very important, and you need to know who William Shakespeare was. Again, English literature probably reaches its peak, many people think, with William Shakespeare. 1564 to 1616 were the times of his life. Now, obviously, Shakespeare is well known for writing sonnets, which are those 14-line poems that we talked about earlier, and plays, and he's known because he portrays human life, he portrays real events emotionally as they relate to everybody. The reason you guys still read Shakespeare's plays today is because everybody can relate to Shakespeare. I mean, there's not a person among us who can't relate to something in one of his stories. So what I want you guys to do right now is you guys are going to read a video, or read a sonnet. And I want you to take a look at this sonnet, who was written to an imaginary woman, maybe not, not really. It was written to this woman, and this woman that he loved, and he talks about her, and I want you to think about how he talks about her. It's not exactly complimentary, but what is it about this poem that makes it Renaissance? So I'm going to change to the next slide, and I want you to pause it, read it, think about it, and write your answer down in your notes. Ready, set, go, take a look, and